Thank you all for coming. First of all, I want to know how many of you are here because you're interested in like having a podcast? Oh, cool. How many of you already have them? Cool. And how many of you are just interested in learning about the business of it? Cool. All right. You are. Okay, cool. Well, so I'm Jenna. I wasn't quite the executive producer of The Moth, but I was a producer there for a while. I recently became the head of audio at BuzzFeed, and we are launching a couple podcasts this month that I'm very excited about. But let's introduce you to the rest of these people. Why don't you guys introduce yourselves? If that works.
Sure. My name is Anna Sale. I host Death, Sex, and Money at WNYC, which is a podcast we launched in May of 2014. So we're getting close to 1 year, which we're pumped for. Before that, I covered news for public radio for 10 years, most recently covering politics for about 5 years straight. Jenna worked for Death, Sex, and Money for 6 weeks, during which time she got the offer to work for BuzzFeed as the director of audio, so we take credit for that. And the other thing that we share is we both were in bands with the same bassist, but not the same band.
Really?
Yeah, Bradley.
Oh yeah. Cool. All right.
The roots of podcasts.
Yes,
Success.
a lot of us are in bands.
It's kind of weird to hear you say Anna Sale. Like sitting next to you here, you say your name. My name is Max. I am a co-host of a podcast called Longform, which is the same name as a website that I co-run. That's also called Longform. And I feel like my role tonight is representing like amateur podcasters. These are like professional people, and we did not know what the fuck we were doing, and have somehow figured out how to pretend like we do. A big part of how we pretend to know what the fuck we are doing is that Jenna edits the podcast. So what we give Jenna is quite bad, and then what comes back is like passable.
My name is Mike Pesca. I was the bassist in Jenna and Anna. My job here tonight is to convince Max that he's doing a great job, yet subtly communicate I'm better than him. I am actually the host of the Slate podcast, The Gist. For 10 years, I was a reporter for NPR, mostly covering sports, but doing a lot of politics before that. I was the 1982 pass punt and kick champion for the New York Jets 10 and under division. My series of tweets on Benjamin Netanyahu's address to Congress recently won a James Thurber Award for American Humor.
Awesome. Very recently.
Yeah, it just happened.
I think that was today.
Sorry, it's just been retracted.
So I think it's a really interesting time for podcasting. I feel like there's this just intense interest in it all of a sudden that we owe a lot of it to Serial, although we were all making podcasts before Serial, but not nearly as popular as Serial. And Serial was an interesting time because it was sort of like a time that everyone I knew started getting, like everyone I knew in audio who had sort of always been in public radio just started getting tons of job offers because I think it made people at media companies all of a sudden all feel like they all needed podcasts. So it's a very good time to get into this business, I would say. And it's been very exciting for us. So I want to ask each of you, how did you get into podcasting? I know two of you started out in radio and then kind of moved into podcasting. You did not do anything in radio, but started a podcast.
I think we have like a traditional podcast story, which is like we were sitting at the bar and we were like, you know what would be interesting is if we made a podcast of this conversation. And it wasn't interesting at all. And so we realized very quickly, actually like the first idea for our podcast was we were gonna rip off the GabFest, except we're gonna do it like about magazines. So every week it'd be me and the two guys I do it with, Aaron and Evan, and then a fourth guy. We were going to, because it was like 4 30-year-old white dudes in Brooklyn, because everyone wants to hear that. And we were going to talk about magazines, and we were going to really like talk shit about them. And then we realized that like we're all cowards, and that no one was going to ever say anything mean. And so we decided to rip off a different podcast, which was WTF, which we were all like pretty big fans of. And basically the idea was we're really interested in these journalists. We have this website where we recommend articles. We noticed that people were starting to follow specific writers rather. And the idea was like, could we have those kinds of conversations? Could we go back and sort of trace the arc of someone's career and really try to figure out like how they do their job? And that's what we did.
Cool.
I guess you could say I got into podcasts when I first started listening to podcasts, which was, I think, before the word podcast existed. Not that I'm an early tech guy, but I love all things audio, and I used to listen to a lot of radio shows under the covers, like shows that maybe some of the older people in the room might recognize. Ira Fistel was this guy on WABC at midnight who would always talk about weird stuff. And what was her name? Sally Jesse Raphael had a talk show. So
She had a radio show?
Oh yeah, for like 10 years on
who
the
knew?
TalkNet network. This is TalkNet. Anyway, I was the first NPR person to have a podcast. It was called On Gambling with Mike Pesca. It was about animal husbandry. And then about 4 years ago, the guys from Slate said, hey, we have a political gab fest, we have a culture gab fest, we want to start a sports one, and we want you to start it. And Josh Levine, who was the sports editor there, will be a part of it. So I've been doing a Slate, and then Stefan Fatsis has joined in. I have been doing a Slate sports podcast for years and years, and Andy Bowers, who runs the podcasting division of Slate, which is now called Panoply, which we have 15 new podcasts under our banner, for years talked to me. I think a daily news podcast could work. I said, I do too. I just don't want to be the one to do it. I like NPR. And then finally, like everything aligned. I was feeling creatively like I really wanted to go there. I did a lot of the stuff I could do at NPR. It's weird to leave a dream job, but this new job is even better.
Nice.
So I didn't have to change jobs. My story is just kind of, I was covering politics. I'd covered the 2012 election, traveling all around swing states, was covering the 2013 mayoral race, and was just getting to that point where you get really tired of talking to political consultants. So I was trying to figure out what I was going to suggest my next beat to be after the election was over. And around that time, a memo went out to all WNYC employees, which said, hey, you're talented, smart people, and you work here. We want new content. We're having a contest. And it was kind of the dream memo because it gave me sort of a homework assignment to figure out exactly if I could do whatever I wanted to do, what would the show sound like, what would it be like, you know, if I could kind of step out of being afraid of losing my kind of journalistic bona fides, which I'd worked really hard for, and you know, with my political reporter colleagues, you know, being in that pack and proving myself, like what would I really want to do? And Death, Sex, and Money kind of came from the idea that I was having all these incredible, interesting, intimate conversations with swing state voters in Walmart parking lots in Iowa and Ohio and Colorado, and we all cared what the divorced woman thought about, you know, her future until November 4th, and then we didn't care about her for another 4 years. So that was sort of the genesis for the show, was I just wanted to hear more of these stories and kind of make the argument that personal story for its own sake was actually really important journalism, given how much is in flux in sort of the American experience of family, economy, et cetera. And I was also in personal flux in my life, so I had a lot of pressing questions that I needed to just ask people. So that was the pitch, and Death, Sex, and Money, the name came to me walking the dog. And I was just like, what are the things that we all worry about? And I thought of Death, Sex, and Money, and then I thought, oh my gosh, that's DSM, like the psychiatric manual. That is hilarious. So that's where it came from. And so people want to call it Sex, Death, and Money all the time, but it's really important that it's DSM to get the joke.
Cool. And I think another thing that a lot of podcasters are talking about now, and that a lot of people don't understand and we don't fully understand, is like, what are the differences between radio and podcast? Are there differences? And I feel like there definitely are, and I feel like your show especially, and Mike's too, well, all of ours really, they sort of, like, but your show, because it's at WNYC, I think really highlights that. I know even working on it for like 6 weeks, one of the amazing things is that you don't have to think about a clock. So you can make them whatever length you want. And that's like very, very freeing in a lot of ways. But what are other differences that starting with you, that you've noticed, or like that you've seen in podcast versus radio in your career?
I mean, I feel like when you come up as a public radio reporter, you learn a formula really quickly, how to do the 30-second spot, the 90-second spot, the 3.5-minute feature, and the 8-minute feature if you work on it for a couple of weeks. And you figure out how to write a really great lead for a host, and then a really great lead for you, and then a really nice kicker at the end, and then your out cue. And there's a lot of creativity within those formulas, but losing that structure when you start a podcast, it was terrifying, and also just like, whoa, what can we do? And so that was the first thing that I thought a lot about in development. And I think as we've been producing the show, it's dawning on me like how much freer I feel to push on edgy topics and this idea that we have this intimate community of listeners and that relationship, and I feel pushed by the listeners to like go there even more on kind of questions that I wouldn't ask if I were sitting in on a talk show that was being broadcast where you didn't know if people's 7-year-olds were listening, in the background. And so we can curse, we can, and we can also know that listeners are listening at a time when it's convenient for them, and people are opting in. So that really changes the way that you, I think, prepare the thing that you're making for them.
Well, yeah, in the abstract, I would say that freeing is a good word. I think that podcasts are inherently niche, even when they're serial. And I think that the guiding principle of a place like NPR is, don't lose anyone. Okay, maybe there'll be a small single-digit % of the audience that doesn't know what you're talking about, but your references should go slow enough that you kind of hold everyone's hand. And the organizing principle is that people don't say, what's that about? And my principle is sort of to go fast and to say, if this isn't for you, this isn't for you, but to really find the passionate audience that it is for. And so that means a lot of things, but because that's how I consume media too. Like I never quite got don't use that word, people might be confused. As a consumer, I always said, well, I want to know what a factotum is. And then I found out, and it was disgusting. So that's in the abstract. In the specific, all the stuff you talk about, it all has good sides and bad sides. Like, you could go long, and that's freeing. It's also, to the audience, sometimes boring. I believe that that creativity and limitations go hand in hand. And I believe that if you look at the history of the most creative periods, things like the era of film noir, it was when there were so many strictures on what you could possibly do. So within those parameters, you could get so creative. And now that all bets are off, sometimes I wonder what the definition of creativity is. And also it's not all about me. Like one good thing about NPR is service the audience. So I still have that instilled in me. And I do think a lot of podcasts, maybe not the popular ones, do have this level of indulgence that they need to check against.
Might be a connection there, though. Popular ones that don't have that indulgence.
Yeah. But some of them do, too. I mean, I love WTF, but that at times is like a super indulgent podcast.
Oh, yeah. I mean, ours is also super indulgent. I have no ground to stand on there at all. It's not particularly super popular out there. So it's fine. I've never done radio before, so I don't really have a good answer.
All right, cool.
That's okay. You get 3 passes around.
Thanks. Great.
Yeah, I've found actually that moving to just podcasts where there is no radio element has sort of made me set more extreme limits on myself than I had before. Where I'm not going to make any podcasts that are more than 45 minutes long at BuzzFeed. I just feel like after that, people get bored. I like to think of it as like a commute thing. A lot of people commute either 20 minutes, they'll listen to the first half on their way there, and then the second half on their way home. Or they have 40-minute subway commutes. I actually polled a lot of people to ask how long their subway commutes are, and 40 seemed like the average. So I feel like that's a really good time. And that is actually the time that the vast majority of people are listening to podcasts is on their commute.
Or on the treadmill. So I feel
yes.
a 5K is a good way to think about,
Yeah, and over the holidays, podcast numbers shot down because people, when they're with their home with their families, they're not listening to their podcasts. It's very much a part of your routine, and when you're not doing your regular routine, you're not really listening to podcasts, which is interesting. So, we have little clips that we want to play from each of our shows, and Mike, why don't we start with yours because this is from today, right?
I think it was from 2 days, from
2 days.
Friday.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
From Friday. It was,
All
you were talking about the dress.
Yeah, okay, so I think I started just by saying, I was reading this article in the Wall Street Journal, and they were talking about how leggings are really popular now, even more popular than yoga is, and it's part of the athleisure category. And I said, athleisure, this idea that you're going, somehow this idea you're going to invent this category called athleisure, and I'm going to sign on for it. And you've hyphenated it bizarrely, because it can be athle, and then the hyphen, like athletic and leisure, or it can be ath and then the hyphen and leisure, right? So where's the hyphen? I mean, this idea that somehow you could throw a hyphen in there and I'm gonna sign on to it. And then I started talking about the dress. I'm like, this notion that just because we have two different ways of viewing a piece of fabric, that it's all gonna go viral just because it has gone viral, it's infuriating. And then I reveal, all right, my spiel, which is what I call like sometimes it's a rant at the end of the show, wasn't really about what I'd just been saying. And then I think this is where we join the clip. And that, just listeners, and I should also add now, Panopolesians, that is my theme today. No, nothing about the dress, nothing about yoga. Phrase I said, the idea that somehow. It's the preamble that has it all. It's embraced by the right.
There's this notion that somehow there's moral equivalence between what the terrorists did and what we do.
And the left.
This notion that somehow there was this ready-made moderate Syrian force.
So right there, you heard Cheney and Obama speaking not of this idea that somehow, but this notion. Notions are good. Notions are good to use in those phrases. Notions are like ideas, but with less ballast, right? You gotta respect ideas. I mean, Booker T. Washington spoke of slavery as the idea that the disadvantage of one man is the good of another. Whereas notion, that's taken less seriously. Let me quote, I'd like to know where you got the notion to rock the boat. Don't rock the boat, baby. Rock the boat. Don't tip the boat over. And that was said by the Hughes Corporation. And remember, corporations are people under the law. This idea that somehow a corporation is a person.
The idea that somehow there is an absolute rejection of the grand jury in Ferguson, Missouri.
It's so much more convenient than explicitly saying, hold on a second while I construct my straw man. It's so much less time consuming than actually and accurately quoting opposition figures who are putting forth bad arguments. It's not in the congressional record, it's in the ether.
The notion that somehow I ran for public office or members of Congress are in this so that they can go around pulling the plug on grandma?
The idea that somehow it's such a great throat clearer, it's a great scene setter, it's a great generator of drama. Remember, drama is conflict. It immediately sets up an opposition and sets it up on your terms. You can use it to quickly conjure arguments that you know are out there, or you could use it to simply make up arguments that you wish were out there, like this.
I had this idea that somehow, if I controlled what I ate, I could never get hurt again.
The idea that somehow is a gift, a trick, a gambit, a ruse, a go-to, and a friend. The idea that somehow you shouldn't use it, this notion that somehow people will ever notice what you're doing and call you on it, that notion is fanciful. Fanciful at best.
Very good.
Long. That was long.
It was great.
That was great.
I actually have a question about that because I was talking to someone before this who was wondering how much of your podcast, or how much of like all of our podcasts are scripted versus how much is just you kind of going on.
Yeah.
And that definitely seemed like it was scripted. Is that true, or?
It's 75% scripted. It's bullet pointed, and then phrases are written out, and interviews are not scripted. Mostly intros to the interviews are. Sometimes, depending on how much time I have, I'll script more. But I always go off script, and sometimes get facts wrong in the process.
Yeah. And how much of yours is scripted?
Mine is pretty scripted. Yeah, my interviews are, like, we do, like, preps. Death, Sex, and Money is basically a produced interview show, so we do extensive research preps, timelines of people's lives, and then a list of questions I'll sort of take in, but I find that I don't look at those very often. I sort of know the narrative arc of the interview when I go in. But the actual episodes, we do a lot of group editing, we listen to chunks, we pay attention to when we stop listening, and then we cut that part out. And then, really kind of winnow down the writing a lot. And then I take a script in, and when I'm voicing it, I sort of kind of like don't improvise a bit while I'm reading, but it's pretty close to a script.
And yours is pretty much not scripted.
I mean, you listen to the raw, you know it's not scripted. The one thing that sort of relates to that though is like when we started, I was going in with like tons of questions, like way more questions than I could ever ask, like a notebook full of questions. And then what I found I was doing was I wasn't really listening to people very well. I was just kind of like waiting to ask the next question on the list. And then I started doing a list of just like fewer questions, like maybe 10 or something. But still, it wasn't quite working all that well. Like I was looking down at the list and like I wanted to cross boxes off, and people would be talking about something super like emotional, and I would cut them off and be like, "And when did you start doing?" It's just terrible. And then eventually I had it. So I just had like acts basically. Like I was just like, we'll talk about this, and then this, and then this, and that's the show. And now actually I go in with a notebook and I have these acts and I end up taking tons of notes during the interview. So like I started with like a huge notebook and now I've gone to, I like build the notebook up during the interview.
So how often then is a show as you preconceive the structure? That you're gonna
The
have
act
the
thing,
acts?
the act thing generally follows that. That's like about as much as you can structure one of these conversations, I think. Is like you just know that you want to talk about a certain piece they wrote or a certain time in their lives or a certain aspect of their work or something. But that's about as much as you can do.
And Mike, is there anything else you wanted to say about this, or feel pretty, like it kind of speaks for itself?
Yeah, I'm interested in a few things, but I'm interested in words and rhetoric. I didn't really realize how much I was until Ira, I think Anna and I both got a pretty good pop when Ira put us on, separately on This American Life, and his thing was, well, we got to do something with your stuff about rhetoric. I'm like, well, what's my stuff about rhetoric? And he said, and he lists all these things. I'm like, oh yeah, I guess I talk about rhetoric a lot. So we're going to be doing some more of them.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I can't help it.
So the IRA thing is actually usually when people are featured on This American Life, their podcasts kind of blow up the next week. So it's like I'll call it like the IRA bump. It doesn't always like last forever, but you can usually count on the week after you were on This American Life, your own podcast being in the top 10 on iTunes. Pretty much always happens.
Yeah.
Or in the top 2, which I think happened to you.
Number 1.
That's
that was
amazing.
so I just want to, like, that speaks to, just Ira Glass and his generosity of sharing that platform with emerging producers and emerging podcasts. It's just like, it's so gracious, and I thank him for it every day.
All right, so Max, why don't we play your clip now? Did you want to intro it in any way?
Okay. This is George Saunders talking in the back of a bookstore, and I was very excited to talk to him, and he was just amazing. He's a very special person, and when Jenna asked me for a clip, I was like, well, maybe we should let people hear that time when George Saunders talked about the meaning of life. And so that's what this is. And you'll notice, there's not a lot of me in there, but there's 2 really important sort of moments where I interject, where I think it's a good description of my style.
When you're saying goodbye to somebody at the airport that you love and you get all soft, you're like, oh my God, I hardly knew you, that kind of feeling. What if that's the truth? That mode is the mode, that times 10, maybe is the mode that we should exist in all the time. Then another day you're just yourself, there's a big gap between those 2 people. So my regret would be how much time did I spend in that regular old stupid habitual mindset of taking everything for granted, as opposed to this exalted state of being super tenderized to the people you care about. And I'm guessing that, if there's a heaven, it's that at the airport times 10 or 20 or 1,000, So I think the regret would be that you, like a lunkhead, you spent so much time in that normal state. Well, I wonder what I'm going to do today. I hope my book is selling, how do I look? Oh, I'm going bald. But instead of that mode is habitual, but we know from the occasional foray into it that the other mode is possible. So then the speech basically says, hurry up, take my advice, hurry up, try to get into that higher state while you can. How do you do it? I don't know. I'm stupid. I'm like a latecomer, but there's these thousands of years of spiritual traditions that wouldn't be a bad place to start. And, a lot of times in our culture, there's this de facto humanist swagger that says, oh, yeah, religion, we used to do that shit, But, what my advice would be to anyone who wanted it was reconfigure your understanding of quote-unquote religion and make it exactly equal to that which will give you that airport state of mind more often, and then go into the existing traditions and cull through them to make it that, or to try to find the authentic elements of those traditions that are really about that, because that's really what they're about,
You guys laughed when I laughed, like nervously, and that was the only thing I did in that clip was like nervously laugh while he was saying that stuff. The other reason I picked that though is I do think the thing that's really powerful about podcasting, and it has a lot to do with that consumption stuff about when people listen and how they listen. Most people listen to these alone, like with headphones, and it's very personal and very intimate. And there was something really magical about that moment, and part of what was great about it was it really wasn't that different than the conversation I would have had with him if there were no microphones. Like, we were just sitting in like the back of a cramped office, and a phone kept ringing all the time, and I kept like hanging it up, and I think it was pretty close to bridging that gap between feeling like you're like eavesdropping on an actual conversation and something sort of performative. Like, that is just how he is. We just happen to have mics on, and I think that's kind of these podcasts at their best, is when it doesn't just feel intimate because you happen to be listening to it on headphones, but it actually is.
Yeah, and something I always tell people when they're making podcasts is like, why is this audio and not written? I think it's important to have like a compelling reason why you're putting something in audio. And that's the kind of thing, like with this interview, where like it just has a bigger impact, I think, than to, like, if I saw that written, I would think it was beautiful, but hearing him say it, there's something that it really adds to it. Is that something that you guys think about a lot? Like, why am I doing this in audio? What makes it compelling in audio versus like another medium when you're making these things? Or you just do not think about that?
No, I do. They wanted to turn my spiels into kind of columns, and Jacob Weisberg, who's in charge of the Slate Group, so our editor's editor, is like, no one's doing this. No one's doing, a column, like a well thought out column a day. And I said, okay, here's the problem. So many of them don't work as written columns. Like, some would, but then I throw to a clip without explaining it, but then and some of them are just like weirdo sketches. They're not all, ranty spiels. Like the other day, someone came in pretending to be our executive producer and broke down because I called him a bear. Okay, so that wouldn't work. Yeah, I mean, every medium is, I don't even think just why isn't it written, I think why isn't it visual, but because like all of us, Ann and I are radio people, and we always think in I think, audio form, right?
Yeah. I mean, the voice, like just hearing someone tell their own story in their voice is just arresting in a way that even reading like the most confessional personal essay isn't. I mean, I remember I was getting on the F train during that moment in the George Saunders interview. Like, I can remember precisely where I was, because I was like, wow. And I was surrounded by all these people, but that was the...
Yeah, I think it would have been, in hindsight, like way easier for us to just do like Q&As over email with writers. And there's something about like the work it takes to get two people in a room that I think is valuable in these conversations too. Like, again, like the setting there I think is important. Like, it wasn't an NPR studio. Like, we just had microphones on a desk, but it had been this whole thing. It took a while to find a time, and like he was about to go do a like reading with Ben Stiller, like at the bookstore right afterwards, and there's all these people waiting outside for him, and it never would have been like that if we'd just been trading emails. We never would have gotten to that point. And the thing we were talking about was a speech he gave, which is the same thing. And this is like, one of the great writers of our time, and what we actually ended up talking about was another time where he spoke to people.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people think about the difference between like TV and movies and radio, and I feel like it's just really exciting. Like when I'm listening to This American Life, I'm totally using my imagination kind of more than I ever do because I'm trying to picture everything they're talking about. And so there's something about it not being right in front of you that makes your brain sort of have to work a little more, which is fun.
Yeah, but did you all listen to the This American Life about cops? It just came out.
Oh, yeah.
The first segment of the first episode, like if you haven't listened, listen.
The window breaking.
But there's a sound of a window breaking, and if you had seen it, it wouldn't, like, I don't know, it would have just like, but when you hear it, it's just like the most terrifying thing.
Yeah.
And it was like a viral video, but I experienced it in such a different way on the show.
The other thing I'll say is that I think if we were doing them as like written interviews, people would be a lot more self-conscious about what they said. And I think like if you just talk to anyone for 45 minutes or an hour, like you kind of drop your guard inevitably and start being a little bit more honest. The other thing that's happened with us several times is like towards the end of an interview, particularly when people don't come to our studio, but like when I go to their house or whatever, at the end of the interview, people will be like, how many people even listen to this anyway? And I'll be like, I don't know, like 50, 60,000. And they'll be like, so I try and like, that's the other part of it though, is just like a guy shows up at your house with some microphones. It's not something you're gonna like worry about while you're having the conversation.
Also, putting aside all the kind of calls to craftsmanship, you can't watch TV or read while driving a car. Like the reason that this forum is definitely going to succeed and prosper, it's the only form of, for all the new media that's getting invented, it's the only form of media that you could do while doing something else. People are busy, and they like that.
It does work well. Let's play your play.
Okay?
And so is this from the most recent episode? And did you want to intro it?
Yeah, I'll just set it up a little bit. So Death, Sex, and Money, we do a combination of different things. Some interviews are interviews with famous people talking about kind of key moments of transition in their lives. Some interviews are deep dives with people you haven't heard of that are about kind of a particularly sort of gripping story. Like we did an interview with a young couple who had been together before and after one of their gender transitions, and just what that was like in the relationship. And then more and more, we're doing episodes built around stories that listeners send in, and this we just sort of started doing. We asked, everybody, we presumed that a lot of people had smartphones because they're listening to podcasts. So if you have a smartphone, you have a way to record yourself. And so we just started asking these really broad questions about how do you deal with money in your relationship? Tell us your story. Or what is it like if you live alone? Tell us your story. And then the most recent one we did was about cheating in relationships. And the quality of the tape of just people confessing either their complete heartbreak and humiliation of being cheated on or their shame of currently cheating or having cheated was really kind of striking to sit at my desk and listen to these memos that are coming into my inbox. So we stitched an episode together about that. And this just kind of gives you a sense of that. And I think I think it's really cool because it speaks to just the ways that the relationship that a podcast can have with its listeners in an ongoing conversation. Just to set this up, we're starting with a guy it's not his real name, but I called him Joe from Texas. And the setup was he's in his mid-40s, and since high school, he said he's only been with women who were unavailable, who were in other relationships, and he was the third party. And so I asked him about that.
There's a pattern that you can look back on your life and see that you've been with a series of women who weren't available to be just with you. But it sounds like you haven't quite figured that out, why that is.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've got reasons why I believe that. Physically, I'm an overweight guy. So I feel like that's probably why I can't be the number one choice. They may love my sense of humor and my kind of compassionate side and the fact that I'm not afraid to let out my feelings and tell them different things, all that loses to the fact that I'm not 6'4" and have rock hard abs and look fabulous or something, you know?
Yeah. How tall are you and how much do you weigh?
I'm 6'1", and I'm very happy to say that I'm about 295 right now. I lost about 45 pounds in the last year.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. I'm kind of I'm trying to be done being ashamed of anything about me and just putting it out there and saying, this is me, this is who I am.
I've been married 3 times, and each time I went out and cheated to find, I guess, love.
It's so much harder being on this side of things that I think people realize.
You need to talk about endings before you're beginning. You need to talk about, if it all falls apart, how would we behave? How would you want to behave?
And we don't offer enough support to those that have made mistakes like this.
I'm trying to be loyal in that area. I hope that it works out this time.
And it has to be said, when you're talking about sex, sometimes there are consequences beyond busted relationships and emotional wounds. Cheating can lead to a child.
I found out later that he had gotten a friend of his pregnant.
That's the end of the clip. Dun, dun, dun. So now you have to listen. But so you can hear there, so Joe in Texas was a guy who sent in a voice memo, and then we followed up with him and set up a studio interview. And then the women that you heard, kind of the montage, those were all just voice memos. And then the memo about the sound of the boyfriend getting the woman pregnant was a voice memo, and then I go on to talk with her and kind of learn more about that story.
And your podcast is like, you know, you have like my favorite podcast, and I feel like I tell you that a lot, and I tell everybody else, because like something that's so great about podcasting is that there is this like real kind of intimacy with your listeners, and I feel like you have that like on this amazing level where you're just like totally listening to your listeners. And like, how did that start, and sort of how has it progressed, and what kinds of, I mean, like, and are you still like talking to any of these people, or like, how does that work? Because it's so intimate.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, it is so odd because I used to be a politics reporter, and I used to, you know, be a straight kind of conventional reporter. And so I think it started early on in the podcast, because one of the first episodes, the one that aired on This American Life, was a story that was just kind of this cuckoo thing that happened in my own life, where I was broken up with my boyfriend, and he asked for help from a former retired senator, Alan Simpson, in Wyoming. And this was all happening as I'm developing this podcast. So I was like, shit, now I have to do this whole episode about my life and how I have commitment fears and how I'm divorced and in my mid-30s and don't know if I'm going to have kids and blah, 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 blah. So, but I had to do it because it's like, if you're going to have a show about death, sex, and money and life choices, like, you got to go there. And it's also one of the best talkers in the history of American politics, and his wife, who he's been with for 60 years. So that, I think, just kind of starting the show with this idea that, like, I'm figuring it out too, and let's just kind of fumble our way through together.
And to clarify, your boyfriend wanted help from Ellen Simpson to get you back.
Oh, to get me back, sorry. Did I leave that out? Yeah, he got me back. We're getting married. Yay! It's a good story.
And we should also add, your boyfriend, we should disclose, your boyfriend is Erskine Bowles, the co-chair.
Yes, and we are going to solve the debt crisis.
Yeah. Which is really cool.
Cool. So yeah, so it sort of started with you being super vulnerable, and then I think that seemed to like allow other people to be vulnerable with you. So
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. And I think it's also like, it's something about like social media and Twitter and like the ongoing relationship you have with your listeners is like, it's just so much more in your face with podcasting than it ever was in broadcast. Like, you know, I'm sure people would yell at the radio at how I covered X zoning decision in West Virginia when I was starting out, but they weren't getting up in my face and saying like, this really affects my life. You know, they were sometimes, but like Twitter and da-da-da. So you know these people, and so it's much easier to kind of follow what's happening in listeners' lives and to feel like you have an ongoing relationship.
The last clip I'm going to play is from a show that is not yet released. And if you guys were at the WNYC panel last week, you heard this, which I know a few of you are. But yeah, so at BuzzFeed, we are hoping to launch podcasts at the end of March. We don't have specific dates yet, but look for those at buzzfeed.com/podcasts, which should be launching in the next couple weeks. And basically, what I'll say about this is that one of the podcasts is two women, Heaven Nagatu and Tracy Clayton, who are some of BuzzFeed's like funniest and best writers, and it's them hosting a podcast together. And this is Tracy talking about going to a party that she thought was going to be like a lot of like hot young Brooklyn artists, and it turned out that it was a 65-year-old's birthday party in Flatbush. And she's describing the crowd, and she's describing a type of person there that she calls cat daddies. So let's play that.
So a cat daddy, for those listening who are not familiar, a cat daddy is a 65-year-old plus man who dresses in nothing but Steve Harvey suits, Stacey Adams shoes of very loud colors, linen
Very
shirts,
loud.
very
Yeah.
loud. And they go to these like clubs on the weekends, and they just like to go and like buy young girls drinks.
Yeah.
Which is why I love a cat daddy. I
mean,
broke,
sure.
it's not payday.
Yes.
Listen, let's
will-
go to Frank's in Brooklyn and see what we can do, you know?
Okay.
So they walk up to you and they're just like, "Hey, how you doing? How you doing?" I'm like, I'm fine. Oh, well, I can see you fine, but I asked you how you doing. Don't. So this is a cat daddy, okay?
Oh, man.
Every man there who was not a DJ, there were only 2 DJs. So basically every man there is a cat daddy. Now, in a club situation, there's something that we can trade, right? You can buy me a drink, I'll give you a few minutes of conversation, then I take my black ass home. Here, the drinks are already free, so I don't want to talk to you guys. However, so we're sitting on a bench, me and all 5 of my friends, and like there's a literal arc of cat daddies, just like they like built a wall, like
sounds like a nightmare.
like a flying V of poorly dressed geese. Is what this was.
Okay. So I think what's interesting about, or like what I'm really excited about with this podcast, among a lot of things, I think it's going to be hilarious, it's going to be smart, fun, interesting. But there's been a really interesting conversation going on recently, especially in the public radio world. This guy named Chenjerai Kumanyika wrote kind of a manifesto about what it's like to be Black and making a radio, like working in public radio specifically. So it was, he wrote this thing and then BuzzFeed republished it called The Whiteness of the Public Radio Voice, which is really interesting and I really recommend reading it. And it was basically about how, like, even if you're a person of color working in public radio, you're sort of expected to have a very, like, white-sounding voice. And then a lot of people were kind of talking about this issue, and they were like, well, what are some podcasts by people of color? And it's really, the numbers are very low, really kind of embarrassingly low. It's kind of like a white male-dominated space. And so I'm really excited that, like, at BuzzFeed, we're going to try to make podcasts like this, and we're going to try to make more and more podcasts featuring people of color and young people, and just kind of a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily have podcasts outside of BuzzFeed. So yeah, that's a fun thing that we're working on.
What's it going to be called?
It's called Another Round. They get pretty drunk while they're recording. And they get drunker and drunker, and by the end it gets pretty wacky, and then we end the show. So it's fun. A lot of bourbon. Cool, so we are gonna wrap this up in about 5 minutes and ask questions. The one last thing, and this is something that like everyone always comes up to me after any sort of event and asks, because I feel like it's a little bit hard to talk about and rarely gets asked at these events. A lot of people want to know how podcasts make money. And yeah, right. So we don't have to get too far into it, but Max, like your experience is interesting because you're not working for a company that's raising the money. You're basically like doing it all yourself, and you had to learn how to do that.
Yeah.
And you've done it very successfully. You've done it well.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. So do you want to talk a little bit about how?
Yeah, I think like it's interesting when you guys are talking about like the IRA bump, because I got no IRA bump, and but I did get the long form bump, and we were able to launch the show off of like a relatively successful website, and I don't know how. I honestly don't know how a podcast is supposed to sort of like take off without some lift from somewhere. So we had a bunch of people who were coming to the website every day who were interested in reading these articles. Turned out that some percentage of them were also interested in hearing from the people who wrote them. And on the business side, it's very similar to, in a way, it's very similar to how we run the business of the website too, which is just like looking for advertisers who are interested in reaching the audience that we're reaching, and trying to not do things that we think suck. So those are like basically our two rules: is work with people who are interested in working with us, and also try and do things that we're like excited about. And we do a bunch of advertising on the website that I think is actually like pretty good. And the podcast advertising, we sort of do a combination of stuff we sell ourselves, and then we work with a podcast network that sells ads as well. And it has turned into like a pretty decent little business for us. And I think part of that is just like, you guys all listen to these shows, you know that these are kind of better ads than you encounter almost anywhere else. They're just the people that you've been listening to talking to you about a thing, and I think it's like abundantly clear what's going on. There's never any question about like whether this is paid or not, which I think is like a nice thing. So yeah, we've been able to sort of jump into an ecosystem that I think like podcasts at the sort of some percentage are able to get into that loop where you're in the advertising loop. I don't know how you get to that level. I think that's really, really hard to get to like where you've got tens of thousands of people listening to every episode. That's a leap that I think is really challenging, remains really challenging. Once you're there, the advertising money is kind of like sitting there for you.
It's true.
It also has increased a lot since we started the show. Like more and more people are coming to us who are interested in doing their first podcast ads, don't really know what that means. We're kind of like holding their hand through the process, which is pretty different than most advertising relationships. The other thing that, I don't know, this doesn't totally connect to the business side, but I got a call this week from like an NFL franchise that wants to start a podcast. So it's like everyone's trying to do it now.
What was it, the Jacksonville Jaguars?
I will say it was not the Jacksonville Jaguars. It is a woebegone franchise, but they're not going to put out a very good product on the field, so they're looking for other opportunities. But
are they looking to tank the podcast to get a top
get
draft pick?
a top draft pick? Yeah, that's why they hired me, Mike. So anyway, the answer to the business question is like we do not make a ton of insane money. Like no one bought a house from the podcast, but like people did buy many dinners from the podcast for sure. Like maybe even paid rent a couple of times. And I do think that is in large part about the sort of efficiency and style of those ads. Even when we have a lot of them, like I never hear anything negative about the ads on the show. It's only positive. And if you guys listen, we've had Tiny Letter has sponsored every episode for like 2 years. And people come up to me and are like, it's a simple, elegant way to send an email newsletter. People are into it. It works,
Speaking of Tiny Letter, there's a really great Tiny Letter you can subscribe to called Hot Pod. It's by Nicholas Qua, who I believe is here today. There he is. And he's kind of writing like the podcast industry newsletter through Tiny Letter. So sign up. I'm happy to tell you more after. Did you guys want to end with anything, or should we just open it up to questions?
Was there a better business answer that you would?
No, that's perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's an advertising-supported medium.
Yeah.
Advertisers are getting more into it because of, I think, cereal. Now, huge brands right now are a little uncomfortable because the biggest audiences aren't what Chevy wants it to be. But we've done cars because we've sold it with other Slate stuff. So that's where it's going.
Yeah, I mean, we had the show that goes up tomorrow. HP is a sponsor of the show that goes up tomorrow.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
what I said.
And my podcast is still supported by your pledge dollars, and I'll be doing the pledge
I
drive
had a
tomorrow
question for you.
morning during morning edition. So call in.
Did that when you did like the text me $10 thing? How did that work out?
Yeah.
That was.
It was good, and that's like because it's interesting working for a company, and I don't know if you have this experience, Mike, but working for a company, it's like there's the pledge money that comes in because people have a relationship to the big organization that you are lucky to work for, like WNYC. And then there's like when you're a new brand, trying to show the bosses that people care. And so, things like a text campaign can be like, look, we have all these listeners in Colorado that you don't think about because they're not the ones who show up at WNYC events in Brooklyn or in Manhattan. So,
do you have to take that money upstairs, or do you get to keep it for you?
it all goes into the big pot, and then I get my money.
So you're just trying to like be a good earner.
Yes, exactly.
With enough to wet your beak.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you got to get yours, but
Yeah, exactly. Murder with both hands over here, Capello.
So let's open it up to questions.
Hi, my name is Bianca McCarthy. I'm from Case University. Do you ever find the use of like visuals, as in like amendments, I guess, to your podcast, like extra stuff? Do you find that limiting to the audience, or like? What would you consider like limiting for a podcast for the the listener?
You mean sort of like adding multimedia?
Yeah.
I think it's great. Yeah, I don't think I think putting up a photo of somebody doesn't necessarily take away from somebody's imagination of listening. I don't know if you guys feel that way.
Well, we do a vexillology segment, which, as you know, is the study of flags. And you said you went to Pace, right? So yeah. It helps to look at the flags. But other than that,
well, I think to connect that a little bit to that newness question, I think I actually don't totally buy the idea that like everyone's saying it's so new. I think it's just like a bunch of people are paying attention to it who weren't paying attention to it before. That's actually what's new. What's not new at all is the technology, which is still like terrible. And I think the thing that might change, I really hope will change, is that the technology and how these things are distributed improves. And then I think there's some real opportunities there. And because like I'm the person who had to answer the business question, the thing that I think about is like, it'd be great is if I didn't have to say like, go to squarespace.com, then there's gonna be a box. When you find the box, type in long form if you remember, and then you're gonna get like $2 off. If when you were listening to that, I was like, look at your phone now, and then like just use your eyes to look at the ad. That would be great. That would be a huge leap forward. So in that way, I think visuals would be really nice and a way to like connect that. The other thing is another business thing, but the way that ads work now is kind of broken. So like, your cheating episode, right? That's gonna like. People are going to be finding that episode for years. And there will be people who are cheating and trying to like work through their problems. And they're going to come back to that, but someone's going to link to it at some point and it's going to get 20,000 listens somewhere. And whatever that MP3 is whatever those people are going to listen to. And whoever paid to advertise on your show has already paid. So you're putting out all of these listens and you're not getting paid for those. So another way that I think it'll be interesting to see how it evolves from a tech standpoint is will you be able to like monetize your backlist, and will advertising work the same way it does on TV, where it's like it's not like you buy an ad on a show and then you get every rerun for life,
My name is Ellen Schwartz, and I have a little niche podcast called The Dyslexia Quest. It's for the dyslexic community, and it's an interview-based podcast. And I'm curious what you guys think about this dynamic that more and more people are creating podcasts and these networks are coming at the same time, and like what happens to all the people in the middle that like are maybe small and niched and not affiliated with networks, when more and more networks, like you said, next year there'll be like 12 big names are kind of like becoming the podcasting world, and then like all these other people that are coming on the platform, but also some really shitty content that's out there on iTunes, and like people are becoming more and more skeptical of just like hitting search and searching like a topic, because it might just be like really badly produced, just terrible like rant for 45 minutes.
I think it's a legit concern, and I worry that, I mean, the networks are good for those in the networks, but I want the ability to find an undiscovered gem. I was talking to Adam Davidson about this podcast that he got into about fertility treatments, and they don't really ever want to have an audience more than 2,000. I mean, I guess they would, but they don't expect it, and it's very niche. It sounds like maybe your podcast is that way, and exactly what you're saying, you know, how can you tell the good one versus the person who doesn't even know the mic themselves, and you try clicking on that 3 times, and then all of a sudden you're out. So I do think the biggest, or among the biggest challenges for our industry is, you know, curation and pointing people to the right stuff.
I think that's true. There's not a great mechanism right now to surface that stuff that's great. And I do think part of that is more people being like Ira Glass and like finding like that is how audiences shift with podcasts, is like you are brought up to the big leagues and you bring some people back down with you, you know? So I do think that's part of it too, is people who do have larger audiences finding ways to highlight people who don't.
I would also say, like, if you're making a podcast that you are proud of and you like the way it sounds, if I search for dyslexia in iTunes and
Only me.
Yeah, well, if there comes to be like 6 or 8 or 10, like I will sort of sample, and it's like I'll make a 10-second decision whether I'm going to download an episode. So I think it's an argument for making sure you're putting out episodes that you're proud of and sound good on that very first impression, because people are fickle consumers. But then once they love you, they'll be very loyal.
All right, we have to end now, but we'll be here for a little while if you want to talk to us. And thanks for coming.